A very warm welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our session, which is on the theme of evolving architecture of the net zero power system. The recent advances in operational technologies and information technologies have the potential for a very efficient grid management at a lower cost. We're very pleased to extend a very warm welcome to our eminent speakers here. We have with us, ladies and gentlemen, our session chair, moderator, and also our theme presentator, Dr. Mani Vadari, founder and president of Modern Grid Solutions. Please welcome him with a big round of applause. Our speakers, may I extend a very warm welcome. We have with us Mr. Mark F. McGranham, who's an EPRI Fellow and Vice President of Power Delivery and Utilization from Electric Power Research Institute. He has joined us virtually. A very warm welcome to you, Mr. McGranham. Luciano Martini, Chair Executive Committee from ISCAN. Ms. Vida Rosite, Policy Analyst and Project Manager, Digital Demand-Driven Electricity Networks Initiative, International Energy Agency. Mr. Mukesh Dadich, Head Business Development, Sustainability and Clean Technologies, BSES Yamuna Power Limited. And last but not least, Mr. Amitabh Singhal from Power Systems Expert from L&T. A very warm welcome to you. And with these words, I would like to request session moderator to kindly make his opening remarks and also his theme presentation, and then subsequently moderate the session. Over to you, Dr. Vadari.
Welcome to this session. Always tough to have a session after lunch, and more importantly, after another session that just ended, and we've got a 10-minute break here, but we hope that people will come back. Thank you so much. We hope that people will come back very quickly. One of the things about sessions like conferences like this is we very often talk about supply challenges. We talk about net zero. We talk about all of those things, and they're all very important. Don't get me wrong. They're actually extremely important. We also talk about the consumer at the other end and what their motivations are and so on. Along the way, I think many times we miss talking about how are we going to get that power to that consumer? What are some of the things we need to do? What are some of the things we need to have? And so one of the things that I was asked by the United States Department of Energy was actually to start looking at what does it take to deliver that power to these customers. That was kind of an important point that we needed to get to. So how do we actually deliver that power? So a quick interruption. Can somebody get Ravi's name here, please? No, we would never do that. We love you too much for that. So, but now please use my chair. I will find another chair. Yes. Thank you. So kind of where we are going with that is this session is really about what does it take to deliver that power to the consumer. I look at it there are two perspectives here. One of them is the redesign of the power system itself to make sure that we can do some things. What are some of those things? The ability to handle two-way power. Right? That's a very important part of it, because as distributed energy, and we are beginning to call them, actually we are not, in the US in many places, we are not using DERs anymore. We are trying to call them variable energy resources. Why? Because they are variable. Why? Because we don't quite have the ability to control them as much. And for the most part, you get solar when the sun is shining, and you get wind when the wind is blowing. That's pretty much it, right? So the reason is, the need to, as more and more of these variable energy resources come on the grid, we need to be able to define how are we going to get that power to the consumer. What do we need to do? What happens when the sun goes down and there is no more solar power? What happens when the wind stops blowing and then there is no wind power? Do we go back to coal? Do we go back to natural gas? Do we go back to something else? So that's kind of the challenge that we're going to start talking about, even though much of our primary focus will be on evolving architectures. And the architectures are focused on making sure that as each of these types of resources change locations, in fact, we think this thing called, how many of you have heard this vehicle to grid as a terminology? Right, many of you. A new terminology that's coming up is called vehicle to X. One of the previous gentlemen was talking about the Ford F-150 that's got an ability to power an entire home from a truck, from a pickup truck. So now suddenly you got not just centralized generation, you got decentralized generation, and for the first time, we have the potential to have mobile generation. So we start looking at all of these things. How do we create an architecture that allows us to still deliver a stable power system in view of all of this? So I'm not going to spend too much time on my slides, but I am going to see if I can go quickly into a particular slide that I wanted to spend some time on, and we'll come back to that. This is an important kind of a conceptual architecture that I had developed as a part of a white paper for the US Department of Energy. No need to take pictures. At the last slide, and you will get copies of this, the link for the Department of Energy white paper is there. And it is an open source article, which means anybody can download it, anybody can read it, anybody can take advantage of it as long as you refer to it in your publication. So if you look at this particular picture, there are a few components here. You, of course, have the centralized systems like your EMS, your ADMS, and OMS, and all of those things, DERMS, and so on. You've got your wholesale market systems where a market is in existence. And then you start going into decentralized stuff, right? And we actually also decided to break it up into a few parts. We said there are decentralized systems, there are distributed systems, there are hierarchical systems, and there are edge systems. And you kind of need to think about all of these because they all have different needs. When you go for a hierarchical system and a centralized system, you believe there is a specific hierarchy that goes down, which means that whatever the lower level systems do, they need to keep each other in the loop. So the architecture needs to be able to support that. If it's completely distributed, it should be able to function in an independent manner so that it already has all the information it needs to perform that analysis, right? And at the edge, it's doing things that is very localized. So you start looking at all of these things. Some level of coordination is needed amongst all of those. And one of the biggest things that everybody's like, all of this data, all of these controls, what about cybersecurity? What about physical security? So we started thinking of this in terms of two buses. You'll see two lines going everywhere in this picture. And the idea was we called one of that, just for the lack of better name, we called one of them the OT bus, meaning that all the control type information goes through that. And then we call the other one the IT bus, which means that the non-critical information could go through that. This allowed us to be able to still share information. Again, remember, it's conceptual. We also talked to most vendors, and most vendors agreed that either it made a lot of sense, or two, they were already moving in this direction. That was a very good validation because we got this white paper reviewed by just about most vendors. So going down that path, you start seeing those constructs that are coming into play, and whether it's a solar farm, a home, a building, a microgrid, edge of the grid on the bottom right, all of those things, and then interaction with the corporate network. That was an important piece to all of these. Laying that as a key piece, the key characteristics, I just pretty much explained most of these things. I did not want to use a slide from a bullets perspective. It was important for us to be able to get back to this and say, let's start thinking about that construct for the grid and what do we need to do to support this 21st century, 22nd century grid. Okay, so keeping that as a challenge, we're going to start inviting key members of the panel to start talking about their perspectives in all of these things. Okay, some ground rules here. Everybody gets somewhere between 7 to 10 minutes of conversation, presentation time. And the second piece of that is if there is a direct question pertinent to that particular section, then we'll allow 1 or 2 questions. But if not, we will probably move to questions at the end. But please reserve your questions. Our objective is to have as lively a conversation as possible, and so that it becomes something that is very interactive. So with that in mind, I think we have Mark McGranahan from EPRI, who is the first speaker. And, maybe we can get him started on getting his presentation. Mark was not able to be here with us, so he's going to patch in live from, I believe, somewhere in California. I believe he lives there. And then he will kind of present to us. Mark, take it away, sir.
That's great. I'm just sound check to see if you guys can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Oh, that's great. And I really appreciate the opportunity to participate remotely, and very sorry that I wasn't able to travel to India for the conference. It would have been fantastic to be part of this session. It's very exciting and very appropriate to be talking about the architecture of the net zero power system, as you just described. This is such an opportunity right now in the industry for innovation and technology to make this architecture a reality. I'm going to assume that you guys can control my slides. Is that right, Shashi? Okay, so you just tell me which slide we're on. I'm going to go to my first slide. Just to follow up on the introduction that on kind of the concept of an architecture for the net zero power system, really we introduced back in 2015, and we called it the integrated grid, and put out a white paper which is readily accessible on the EPRI website around a framework for this integrated grid. And I like to think of it conceptually as an opportunity for local networks, communities, neighborhoods, even individual households to optimize their energy. And then the integrated grid is making that local energy optimization part of the global energy optimization. And that's our challenge as an architecture, to be able to model and take advantage of the local energy management that's optimizing the energy use, optimizing reliability, optimizing resiliency, taking advantage of local resources that are decarbonization resources, that are renewable resources, in the future that are hydrogen resources, taking advantage of local resources, energy storage, flexible management of the load to optimize the local energy use, and place the platforms that make that possible, whether it's peer-to-peer type of platforms, or if it's more traditional platforms where the signals are directed from at multiple levels. These are the challenges that we have to figure out now. On the next slide, in 2018 at EPRI, we introduced the concept of the shared integrated grid. Just kind of refining this concept of the integrated grid and re-emphasizing the opportunity for customers and communities to participate in the flexibility needs of the grid. So, and I think we're seeing that around the world. Here in Ireland, where I am now, we have a flexibility trial that's just being introduced by ESB networks to get flexibility from local areas and make that part of solving both local grid constraints as well as having that flexibility participate in the wholesale market as we have fluctuations in wind, fluctuations and variations in this availability of solar generation, rather than having peaking generators or generators that are flexible on the bulk system. We can take advantage of the flexibility at the local levels. And this becomes even more important as we electrify more and more of these local systems with electric vehicle charging and heat pumps, and being able to make these new resources as flexible as possible. So my last slide, I just wanted to summarize some of the challenges that I think we're still facing as we try to make this concept of the integrated grid and the shared integrated grid a reality. And so, first of all, we have not solved the architecture problem. What does this look like at an architectural level? We have some very good projects like the OneNet project here in Europe, looking at these architectural issues. We're going to hear more about them in the panel today. Looking at the communication infrastructure requirements and taking advantage of the fact that we are that we have the same reliability requirements for that communication infrastructure that we do for the electric system infrastructure. Let's take advantage of that and make it a common and shared communication infrastructure. We are in the process of talking about how we can accomplish this shared integrated grid using market structures. How do we build markets that can provide incentives for the local flexibility to be part of the grid? How do we build that? How do we put the regulatory requirements in place along with those market structures? Very important area of research right now. The models, as we okay?
Hey, Mark, we lost you for a second. Can you go back to your description of the bullet that started with models?
Yeah, okay. So the models, as we move forward with local energy optimization being an important concept, and we have intelligence at the customer level and the community level, we need to be able to model that and plan for that as part of our design of the T&D system, as part of our infrastructure investment plans. So these models are very, very important, and they're not in place yet. So it's a research opportunity. And then we have to go to operations and figure out how to use this architecture to actually manage those resources with market elements or with direct control elements or other approaches for making this concept of a DERMS work with our distribution and transmission management systems of the future. And then as we go up the system, we have to also make sure that we're coordinating and have the information exchanges in place between the TSO and the DSO. That's the main focus of the OneNet project here in Europe. We've put together a lot of initial requirements for that interaction, but the systems still need to be developed. So we can see that there's great opportunities for innovation. There's great opportunities for new technology providers to be part of these solutions, and it's a very exciting time. So I just wanted to kind of provide that background as a starting point for our discussions on this panel. Thank you very much.
Mark, I just wanted to kind of highlight a comment that in one of your bullets on the models. I find that quite fascinating. I'm so glad you put it out there, primarily because that's one that we have been struggling with in a variety of places, because the word model means so many things to so many people, right? You've got not just the physical model, but you got the contractual model, you got the ownership model, and all of those things. Because if you're dispatching a third-party generator, keeping track of the stakeholders and all of those things starts becoming important. So I'm very glad you brought that in. Thank you so much. I'm sure we'll come back to more questions. But with that, I wanted to go to the second speaker on our list. Who's the second speaker? Can you get started on the second speaker? I'm sorry? Mr. Ravi, yes. We'll now invite Mr. Ravi Sitapati.
Thank you, Mani. I'm just going to build actually on Mark and Mani's opening statements and take it at one level higher, because for many, many people, it becomes one of where do we draw the line and what are going to be the challenges before we get to how do we start planning the physical assets themselves. The first is the concept of net zero, which is where today we are. We were, till the last 4 or 5 years, for the last 15 years, we were talking of net reductions. So coal-fired plants, oil and gas-fired plants were typically slated to be shut down somewhere in the future. We didn't know when, but it was slated to be shut down. With net zero now, you're not sure which one will be shut down because it may have a compensatory effect on another net zero sink. So it could very well be that A will be shut down, B will not be shut down, C will be shut down. So the probability of what we call adaptiveness actually, in my view, increases tremendously. So that poses 3 challenges, right? One is the whole utility system is built around a regulatory structure of very stable returns. So if you look at a bridge with the piers being a typical transmission and generation, the pier is the generation and the bridge is the transmission and distribution to some extent. So in Ontario, when we took out 19,500 megawatts of coal back in 2012 to 2014, several piers came down. So along with that pier coming down, it was not a question of just generators shutting down. We had to offset it by 500 kV and 230 kV build-outs to stiffen the bridge, simply because you can't take piers out of a building, out of a bridge and not crash. So that was one effect, and then the regulator gave us a fair bit of questions on that as well. So that is your second aspect of when you take generation down. As you move to the grid edge, you now have the issue, in my view, again, as a power systems person, is one of all your problems of stability, because simply now your source is not strong enough at the grid edge as you take away centralized generation. So if you have more and more inverter-based generation, you have to think of very sort of nifty ways of how to maintain that stability to get your reactive power control. So I think the utility will now want to be behind the meter, because many, many benefits that accrue behind the meter to get some of these objectives met would also lie with expenditures or investments from the utility themselves. So you're going to have that dialogue, which currently the regulator prevents you. He doesn't want you to come behind the meter. So that's one. The whole notion, in fact, of return on assets become a problem. I was asked this question every time I went to the regulator. My president would sit next to me. We had a $900 million ask on the regulator every 2 years. But for my 66 million, my president would sit next to me to say, don't you screw up. And the reason is the question would be asked, what is your probability that it'll work? And I would say 50%. So then at that time, they'll say, okay, how do you know 50% will work? I'll say, and I'll quote Mark's name, because I was then on the EPRI committee with Mark as well, and we were contributors to Mark's projects at EPRI. And I would say, if 7 people can think and put money together, it's got to be much better than just a flip of a coin of 50%. And the regulator started accepting it. So in 5 years, the regulator took away the word smart grid and basically just made it a business as usual. So think about that in a big way. It will come at the grid edge. Because in the grid edge, you will think more like an ICI. You're not going to think like a utility with 4% depreciation per year or a 6% to 8% return on assets or a stable run for 25 years. You will want that money because as your risk goes up and adaptability goes up, you want to think more like an ICI, whereby your return has to go up and the regulator has to accept that. So the question is, within the utility space or within the policy mind construction, how do people react when suddenly say, I'm going to think like a business and I'm going not to think like a utility anymore? So that is a dialogue to be had with. So we are not even getting to the technical part of it yet, but we already have that, right? The regulator so far doesn't like risk. And so I'll get to the technical part in my balanced 5 minutes. But you have to bring them along because they are the jury, they are the judge, and then in the end, they are the ones who give you a verdict. Sometimes the verdict is not very good. And you have to respect that because it is a statute of law and they are a court. So you have to bring them along. Many of them are not even technical people. They are probably largely lawyers, and finance people, because that is how regulation has evolved over the last 100 years. Has been typically around financial regulation for the benefit of the customer. That's how it has evolved. The last but certainly not the least, in all the projects that I have dealt with in my career, telecom is one to be really careful to watch out for. Data storage and telecom has become like the last straw that breaks the camel's back. You can scale up and up and up and up, and at some point it'll just stop. And I think it was Mani and also Mark who highlighted is you need to have that broad vision. It was also there in the session earlier to us, and I think they brought it up, saying, how far down the road can you think of, and how much do you plan? It's like an airport. The rule is, if you can think of X, you build it to 2X. But you can't do that within our regulatory system, so it is a difficult one. So now let me come to the technical part. Is as you get to all these complexities, and hopefully you can prepare it for your own organization. The key part is, I think the grid edge development, and Mani brought that up, is going to be vital. But many of the assets are sitting behind an inverter. And therefore, your synchronized torque, and I don't see Baba here. I mean, if he was here, he would know. We're all power system guys. It is not there. So the transmission now has to be made stronger to come just before the grid edge, such that you can then say, okay, what do I put just before the grid edge and what do I put just after the grid edge? Knowingly, if you can define what is the grid edge. That itself is an issue, because as bidirectional power flow occurs, you don't know where the grid edge is. In Ontario, for example, when we began in 2006 or 2005, we used to have 44 stations that reversed pumped from distribution to transmission at night, because they were all wind power generation. And so all of a sudden, all of the relayings had to be changed. Everything from distribution side has to be changed, such that 44 kV, 34.5 kV pumped back to 220 kV. With solar now, that's less of a problem, simply because it matches the load a little better. But now wind is coming back again. And so you have to be careful as to how some of these large assets like wind power, 5 megawatt per turbine, may impact on it. So as you get to the grid edge, the question is, we've got lots of what I call boxes. But how do you integrate the boxes? So in a utility that's as big as ours, the Ontario Hydro system, we could not take the star topology of a centralized DMS control back to the edge. It's just way, way too expensive. Large territories to be managed. And so therefore, we chose what is called a hybrid. Where do we take the centralized DMS for central control? And where do we make it autonomous? And we chose the grid edge to be largely autonomous. Now, that's difficult. How do you make it grid autonomous to say, this will work? Some community will say, oh, it's not good for us. Some community will say it's good for us. So you can get away in the urban side, and NIPA and others have done a lot of studies in New York. Europe is another good example where the grid is tight. But you can't do it in many, many parts of the world where the rural grid is weak, including Canada. Okay, our rural grid is as good or as bad as many rural grids anywhere in the world. So people live there. And so I think what we need to be a little cognizant of is, as you get to the grid edge, you need to start paying more and more attention to how you manage the risk at the grid edge. And then how will you allow the utility to get to that grid edge, to be part of the grid edge, maybe even behind the meter? And how will you share the benefits and how will you share the investment? So I will comment on the rest of it a little later, but for now, let me stop here, Mr. Chair.
Good afternoon. So it's my pleasure to try to contribute to this session. I also prepare a few slides in case we can put it up. The topic of this session is extremely important. We are going to have this decarbonized economy. We want to decarbonize our system, power system first, but the grid needs to be fit for all the functionality, all the challenges that we have in front of us. I just prepared a few slides, and of course, all the relevant topics for discussion, I hope we will have also time with the other panelists, are extremely relevant. And of course, something is like we are discussing is already ongoing. So it's ongoing means some solution has been already provided. Nevertheless, not all solutions can be applied in the different contexts. Some of the solutions are more sustainable. Some of the solutions are giving additional advantages. So we are here to discuss and share experiences, which are the ones that work best. So just to recognize that we have this change in the architecture of the power system. It's becoming more and more complex. You know very well that we move from hundreds of generation units to more than 1 million generation units in the same area. This is what happened to Italy, for example, in the last 15 years or less. Most of the units are very small, so we also have to manage a system, distributed energy resources that span from megawatt to kilowatt, and so you need also different solutions. There is a flow energy, there is a transaction related to the economic transaction between different actors, but are also flow data. So this data flow is extremely important because we can collect data, we can analyze data, and also make sure that we know exactly the load profile of what the customer are needing and so on. You see several boxes, several actors in the system. In green, of course, the renewables, PV and wind, but you see also heating and cooling buildings. Then you see also the big load, they are still there, like big factories. You have now households, and the households that become prosumers and so on. And you have also some new babies, so some storage is installed, and also the electric vehicles that is now coming into play. When we talk about electric vehicle, you know that we are now already taking advantage of what we call vehicle to one grid. So vehicle one grid is like a smart charging, is to charge your car when you have plenty of energy from renewables is perfectly fine. If you charge it at night when the load is okay or quite low is also fine. But when you try to charge your car when you have a peak of the load, this is not fine. So we have to be smart also in this kind of action. And then not only smart charging, but what is new, still new, unfortunately, is what we call vehicle to grid. So the possibility for vehicles to provide support to the grid by the million of batteries that will be standing in our cars. So this is something that will be really providing a bigger opportunity. Instead of becoming a challenge for the system, electrifying the transport could become a big opportunity for the system, having an additional way to provide flexibility to the final user and to the system operator. Then, just reporting what is ongoing at ISGAN. Presently the chair of ISGAN. We have several working groups. Working group 6 is dealing with transmission and distribution. And of course, we look into the system at itself. So we have a system approach because it's not just the boxes, but how the boxes connect to the other boxes that matter. So in this case, you'll see that you have an approach that is looking not only to technology, but also to everything that is surrounding technology. I mean, market solution, policy, and regulation is also equally important. Maybe you have a breakthrough in technology, but you cannot apply this technology because the present regulation doesn't allow you. So this is an important aspect. Our working group 6 is dealing with T&D. As I said, is also organized around 4 different tasks, and we have a leader for each of these tasks. And we cover all the related aspects, from expansion planning and market analysis to what happened in terms of system operation and security, entailing also observability and controllability of your system. You have also important monitoring of the technology that can help you during this journey, so technology trends and deployment is covered as well. And then, of course, is also the interaction between the system at different levels. In this case, I saw also in the slide that we have a TSO, DSO coordination or interaction. This is extremely important in order to rule and to manage the grid at best. There is another area where we pay attention to. There are 2 different ways of thinking or 2 different approaches that can be used. One is going to the very, very micro, and one is going to the mega or huge network. So we have some activity there where we compare these 2 approaches that no one is good and no one is perfect, but both of them can be adopted according to the site or the present situation. And in this case, of course, for the micro, you look to distributed generation, you look to a local situation. When you talk about mega, you talk about utility scale renewable, utility scale storage, and so on. I'm almost at the end, just a few more slides. This is just a table just for you, not to read it now, but you see a very simple comparison between the 2 approaches. In one case, of course, it's a kind of a bottom-up, a small-scale approach with the renewables to be installed at the customer side. And in this case, you have a system that can be built up in a short time, is agile, and can help to make the grid reaching all the final customers. But in this case, the complexity is coming from the many, many actors that are coming along. So this is, of course, a challenge because you have to manage and to cover the interest of all of them. And then, of course, there are several other aspects that are very much different between these two approaches. I'm ready to discuss with the panelists also which of the approaches they believe could be successful in India or in other countries. So this is part of a discussion. These two approaches have been utilized already in different parts of the world with different success. There is a strong interest, for example, in Europe about what we call local energy community or renewable energy community. And the main goal is to generate renewable locally and to use that generated power at local place without the burden of the electricity network to carry this electricity far away. So this is a concept that is quite good and I think can be applied as soon as you have a viable renewable available and you have a context already that has some grid already developed. Okay, I think I will stop here and I let the others speak. And thank you for your kind attention.
I actually have a question for you. I actually have a question for you. As you were talking about micros and mega grids, one concept that we were working at the US Department of Energy was to see if you can conceptualize the mega grid as a conglomeration of many, many microgrids. And what I mean by that is over a period of time, from outage management and storm restoration and all those things, if you can take a mega grid and just devolve it into a bunch of microgrids, which then can independently sustain themselves from localized solutions like you have here, how do you see that progression happening? Or more importantly, is that even a worthwhile angle to consider?
Yeah, the answer is kind of complex. I don't see mega grid as just a summation of many microgrids. That will be too little. You have to do more. Because when you look at the we work at the local level, you want to use the renewables that are available, and you want to provide high quality energy to your customer, and this is it. But when you have a microgrid that need to be supported by the main grid, you need to have in place a kind of backbone that supports the microgrid when renewables are not available. Unfortunately, they are not available all the time. So when they are not available, microgrids can become a local community that are still connected to the main grid and receive support. On top of that, I think one important aspect to make our grid really robust is to have this interconnection. So megagrid can be seen as interconnecting large grid, part of a grid, in order also to take advantage of the fact that not always the peak load is at the same time in the same area, in the different areas. So you can also ship energy across this mega grid interconnection in order to make a best use of the energy at that time. Thank you.
Hi, hello. It's a great pleasure to have the opportunity to speak with you today about this hugely important, hugely exciting, but hugely challenging topic. I think I have some slides. And we've been talking now for most of the day about net zero and grids of the future. And you like I, have seen various ways of conceptualizing them. We have boxes, we have interconnections, we have a great many unknowns. There. And here you'll see my diagram again, which is somewhat different from the other ones that we've seen. But what we see here is that power systems are changing, and they need to change at an increasingly rapid rate. And from the International Energy Agency, we monitor trends, we model what implications could happen from different types of policies. And we see that in the past decades, the rate of change has ramped up massively. If we look at renewables, for example, over the previous 5-year period, The amount of renewables that have come online is unprecedented, but if we look to the future, this will not only double, triple, quadruple, but we see order of magnitude of 10 times, 17 times, 20 times in the cases of renewables, distributed energy resources, batteries, electric vehicles, and all of these are opportunities, but they're also disruptors for the power systems. And just we've also, during the past discussions, we've seen a variety of demand curves. Here's one looking at India, and where we have steps, that's our stated policy scenario. And we see we've gone from a relatively manageable flat curve to looking into the future, a huge ramp. And the future is increasingly, it is about peak. It is about how do we keep ahead of peak? And how do we make sure that we don't need to over-dimension our power systems in order to manage this? And here, of course, the leveraging of distributed energy resources comes in, the modulation of demand. And what we see is that the flexibility needs will, of course, be increasing, and all types of flexibilities will need to be leveraged, which again puts further pressure on power systems. And digitalization, as has been mentioned, it is the glue that will hold the future together, and it is a constellation of a variety of different types of technologies that can be meshed together in different ways to provide a myriad of benefits. And importantly, when it comes to digitalization, there are important considerations, of course. We don't need to digitalize everything. We do need to be smart about digitalization. We need to identify what are the functionalities, so that really brings us back to grid architecture. What are the functionalities that we'll need in the future? What are the technology constellations that will help us deliver them? How can we be agile about technologies to avoid a lock-in? How can we avoid interoperability issues going forward? How do we address interconnections with legacy systems and new systems, as well as the risks that come with digitalization, such as cybersecurity, but also risks associated to data and concerns about data. And just a point on data, which we've been discussing, data is absolutely important, and it will be the key factor that will enable us to achieve clean energy transitions. But here again, we need to be smart about data. We do not necessarily need everyone to have as much data as possible. We don't necessarily have the capabilities to handle as much data. So it's being smart about who needs the data at what time in order to effectuate decisions and actions that are needed. So just a few words about the topic at hand. What we see when we look at the area of smart grids, we've seen a shift in recent years from improving the efficiency of processes towards whole system orchestration, and that's increasingly what smart grids need to be about. It's not about having smart meters and having some data that you can analyze. It's about having the functions that give you the visibility, give you the real-time insights, and give you the opportunities to control the system and anticipate also what might be happening in the system, so that you're prepared to manage those challenges going forward. And a few points to consider. Of course, coordination is absolutely important, and that was also raised by colleagues. And going forward towards future power systems, we need to find ways of more effectively cooperating and coordinating between different entities. Scalability. The world is changing at a massively rapid rate. Power systems are changing. We can anticipate what happens in the next few years. We can't really anticipate what happens 10 years down the line. We're looking 40 years down the line. So we need to find systems that can be built up, modular systems that can be combined together going forward. Layering was already mentioned. I think the plug-and-play kind of functionality was mentioned as a bit of a dream, but we're really thinking about how can we utilize assets, whether they're digital, physical, or data infrastructure assets or communication assets in the most efficient way possible. Because as was discussed in the previous session, we also need to make sure that clean energy transitions are affordable. And we have to make the most of every possible asset. And here, digitalization comes in, but also smart management, coordination, and good planning. And here again, digitalization plays a crucial role in giving that visibility and giving that those types of overviews that are needed when tackling the future. And as I already mentioned, the future is hugely dynamic. There will be new things that come up. There are new exciting technologies in the pipeline. So we need to find ways of operating our power systems, in designing our power systems that are flexible, that are agile, that are able to adapt to what will be a continuously dynamic future. And then just a few points on some of the work that we're doing at the International Energy Agency. We have the Digital Demand-Driven Electricity Networks Initiative, where we are looking at the role that digitalization can play in supporting power system decarbonization and resilience. We're focusing on emerging and developing countries, but we're looking at best practices around the world. We have a first policy guidance document coming out in June, where we'll be focusing on what role can digital play in terms of the short-term challenges and the existing challenges that we're already facing, things like losses, reliability issues, difficulties in recovering investments, difficulties to even invest. And because to move towards power systems of the future, we need robust grids already today. We need that basis. So there are already things that we need to fix while we look out into the future. And then our second report will focus on grids of the future, where we'll be really zooming into the challenges and opportunities that accelerated decarbonization will bring to systems, and what are some of the needs and opportunities going forward. Hopefully we'll have some ideas from you, and hopefully we can draw from the excellent work that is already ongoing. And just as a final point, we also have a piloting phase as part of this project, and we have a very interesting pilot here in Delhi, where we're developing a digital twin for a neighborhood in Delhi, where we'll be able to test what are the implications of different types of distributed resources on the power systems, what are the implications for transformers, how can we anticipate possible impacts, and how can we operate the system more effectively. And as a completely final point, we have an exciting session tomorrow, if you would like to join, where we'll be discussing digitalization and distributed solar PV. It's at 10 o'clock. And here we have international experts and national experts coming together and discussing how do we ensure that distributed solar PV does not strain the system, but can be an asset to the system going forward. So if you'd like to join that discussion as well, we would be very happy to hear your views in that. Thank you very much.
Any quick questions directly pertinent to this particular presentation?
I had a quick question. Very nice presentation, by the way, and great organization. On your first slide, thank you. On your first slide, you actually had, thank you, things fine. You had the almost looked like a duck curve, the famous duck curve from California that is so well known. What I found it very intriguing was that you had the residential load showing the duck, but your industrial load was flat. And I also didn't notice data centers, because that's a very hugely emerging, data centers don't typically tend to do the peak and lows, but they're kind of steady. But they're an increasing, especially with 250 million smart meters being rolled out, I'd like to think there's a lot, and also the consumption. You must have heard the news today about how people are consuming, what is that? How many gigs they're consuming a day or something that came out today? Ravi, you're also up on all that trivia. But so what I'm saying is data centers is a big load. So it was two questions. One is why you don't see the the duct for the industrials and data centers?
Thanks. Both very good questions. And so this is a modeling exercise, and modeling exercises can also always be improved. And it's our stated policy scenario, so it doesn't necessarily take into account all the new policies and new directions that could be happening. Definitely, we see data centers as being a rising source of demand, but we're also seeing data centers across the world becoming increasingly more efficient and increasingly more decarbonized, as well as relying on self-generation going forward. So that's why you didn't see that as much. And on industrial, we're quite optimistic there, so that might be the explanation for the lack of big increase.
Thank you so much.
So, thank you, Manik, and very interesting discussions. I was listening to last session, part of last session as well, and this session as well. So, first two things are coming to my mind, that how swiftly we have moved from decarbonization to net zero. And the second one is that while we were talking about ultra mega scale and mega scale, and now we have come down to grid edge and especially to behind the meter. So as a utility operator or system operator, we have to think and provide solutions in this direction only. Most of the solutions which we have seen during the whole presentation in this utility week are designed and to provide relief and to address some of the challenges towards the distribution utility side. As I represent distribution utility, so I will talk more towards the integration of these new energy vectors, especially the non-wired solutions, which we call in form of energy storage, demand response, the electric vehicle load, how to manage that, and other solutions, which is completely new to the distribution world. So, as BSES Yamuna Power Limited, we have already started studying the impact of these different energy vectors into our grid way back in 2016-17, when we first thought that EV will be coming in a big way. Then we commissioned a study that whether to what extent the EV load will be impacting to our network capacity, whether the conventional way of planning, network planning, will work in future or not. And then, of course, the effect of distributed solar rooftop, which is around 35 megawatt in my utility, and we have more than 150 megawatt of solar rooftop capacity within the capital city of India. So far, we have been able to manage that, and we are not using great solutions to manage, but in piecemeal solution, in silos, we are using the data and the management solutions. However, we have done some pilot projects and demonstration projects in case these things ramp up rapidly, and suppose the solar rooftop capacity, which is envisaged as per the draft solar policy of Delhi, which may cross 1000 megawatt or 1500 megawatt in Delhi, then it will be definitely very difficult to manage the uncertainty. Apart from that, the distribution utility is at a very important place, because it has to face the generation uncertainties, variabilities, transmission uncertainties, variabilities, and now the prosumer side as well. As the more and more number of consumers are becoming prosumers, so through net metering, through EV load, which is again, as there were talks about B2G, so we have already started the projects around B2G, not exactly B2G, but we call it B2G, battery to grid. And our regulator has recently approved some of the projects around this particular theme, where the battery swapping stations could be used to push back the power to the grid whenever there is no demand towards from the vehicle side. So that kind of demonstration or the pilot projects have already started, and we are seeing good results. Apart from that, EV load, we are also seeing this as an opportunity as well. We have demonstrated the power management capacity through EV load as well. We have commissioned a station, first of its kind in India last year at our one of the substations, where the EV station can participate in the demand response event. It means that through remote, you can basically regulate the output of EV charging station. Suppose it is currently taking load of 30 kilowatt on CCS, then based on certain algorithm and signals from the SCADA signal, if there is some congestion in the network or maybe some higher power exchange prices, then the load of the particular charger can be reduced for a few minutes or maybe 10 or 15 minutes to say 15 kilowatt, 10 kilowatt or 5 kilowatt is the case maybe, depending on certain algorithm and AI-based solutions. So these kind of solutions will definitely help distribution utilities in managing the new challenges which are coming in form of distributed energy resources. However, we strongly feel that a combined solution of dumps is mainly required, and we are trying different solutions, and the ready-made solutions which are available across the European utilities or market may not be directly fit for Indian regulatory and the other environments, but we have to customize that. So we are working around that, and my friend Sunil is also present here, who is also working for developing some sort of solution in terms of managing the resources, both on supply side and demand side as well. So these are mainly the opportunities available for DISCOMs, how to utilize these energy vectors in terms of managing the load and thereby supporting to what we call it the bridge and the pillars of the grid. So there is obviously greater role of distribution utility in terms of increasing reliability and resilience and flexibility of the entire grid system. Again, coming to the energy storage type, behind the meter energy storage, we are also working towards that. There is already a lot of capacity in form of inverters and other energy storage. We are trying to provide a solution to the consumer in terms of hardware as well, and some sort of commercial agreement as well. At the time of need, probably they can shift some of the load from the utility to existing energy storage within their household. In earlier session as well, Tata Power CEO was mentioning about that there is now no need of flattening the load curve. Rather, we have to adjust our load according to the generation by combining that renewable wind and solar power portfolio. And also discussed about the time of day tariff, whether there is any relevancy of existing time of day tariff or not. So again, coming to this point, definitely in place of time of day tariff, I strongly recommend that it should be opportunity-based some sort of arrangement, because most of the days you are prepared enough to meet the demand. It's only the case of eventuality only. In case of network congestion or something which is not desirable happening in the grid level, then only you probably need these kind of solution, demand response or DSM or some kind of non-wired solutions. So some flexibility towards the time of day could be added in form of additional charges or maybe discount. There are certainly periods where we badly need load from the consumers, because as still we are heavily dependent on the coal-fired stations. So there is obviously a limit to back down that station up to 55%, 60% only, while paying some additional charges. So we have to offtake certain load from there. So we at least need that kind of demand from the consumer. So some additional discount and charges should be allowed to the distribution utility based on certain market signals as well. So we are working around all these things, how to successfully integrate all the new energy vectors which are coming, trying new solutions. And another aspect in this is that probably I have not heard in this session or previous session is the capacity building, which is a very important aspect. Whether our officers or manpower are equipped enough to deal with these new kind of scenarios or new challenges and how to convert that into opportunities. So maybe starting from higher level, this could be planned in a much better way, the training and development programs for the staff or officers involved into this kind of activity, the awareness campaign. Another question I remember during the last session is that often people think that during this whole discussion, normally consumer is left out. Now it's the high time that we have to include the consumer in the whole exercise of designing the grid and other things. The two-way power flow, which is already happening in our distribution area, we are seeing more than 1 megawatt of power flow in the reverse direction already. Transmission system is more or less designed to handle the two-way power flow. But again, it's the distribution system which has to be ready in terms of handling this two-way power flow. In terms of protection system, in terms of manpower safety and equipment safety aspect, and also in terms of measurement and verification purpose as well. So we are dealing with all these issues and challenges. We are also entering into the EV charging field as a CPO because what we feel that the utilities are best placed in terms of operating and managing the EV charging stations. That's why we consciously took this decision to enter into this CPO area, and we have been allocated more than 100 charging stations within Delhi, and out of that 30 stations we have already commissioned on the ground. And we are hopeful that we will be managing more number of stations, thereby contributing to any further demand response program and management of load. So in a way, we are dealing with all these new energy vectors, and we hope that a lot of companies are already present here, will understand our challenges, will sit together with us and customize their solution according to our need. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mani. I would also like to thank ISGF and my company L&T to allow this forum to exchange our views and hear to these esteemed panelists. So I will start with my perspective. So we all know decarbonization, we are trying to replace fossil fuels with the renewables. So that's happening. But this is leading to a lot of decentralization. So we have heard in the forum that there is a lot of power now, which is, traveling two ways. It has been doing it in the transmission level, but it is happening now at the distribution level also. So the consumer is becoming prosumer. The power is getting injected into the network at low voltage, at medium voltage. And this is, in turn, leading to digitalization, in my view, because of this decentralization, there is a lot of data which needs to be generated, which needs to be monitored, which needs to be processed, analyzed, and a lot of control decisions need to be taken. So actually, the data is getting generated like water is flowing in the Niagara Falls. So much of data is coming in the system, and that has to be handled. And that actually leads to the democratization, where obviously with so much of data and so much of things happening at the consumer and at each of the levels, so there are a lot of makes, models, manufacturers who are coming in with their technologies, with their protocols, with their devices. So all of them have to have interoperability. They need to talk to each other. They should be understood by each other. And there are various stakeholders in the whole system. Of course, there are transcos, discoms, generators traditionally, but there are regulators, there are now prosumers, there are the energy exchanges or aggregators in some geographies. So all these need to capture the data which they need for their purposes and analyze it, and the database is same. So everybody has to have access to their data, and that's where we need to have a common architecture or something which is actually clear to everyone. So we all know now that there is the traditional electrical infrastructure, the generation, the transmission and distribution, and there has been over the last few decades a lot of intelligence infrastructure in terms of the measurement devices, the communication devices, the analytical devices. So they are coming into the system. Now a merger of these two actually is what is now happening. Sorry. Yeah, so a lot of the data, as I said, from the consumer meters or from the network flows or from the equipment health status, all that is getting generated and getting processed, getting communicated to the various, let's say, control centers or the owners, and getting handled by the various management system, whether it is meter data management system or distribution management system or energy management system. And in case of the renewables and the batteries, so a lot of DERMS we are talking about. So all these are management systems which are now playing roles to control and manage this whole infrastructure. The second aspect is moving from the inflexibility to the flexible DER operation. So in the left side of the screen, you see a curve where the renewable generation is actually inflexible. So you get what you are getting, what is getting generated, and that is how you are operating. But on the right side, if you see, you have capacities to store the power, whatever you are generating, so you are able to maximize the potential of your renewables as well as to maximize the utilization of your existing assets. So that is now increasing, becoming possible. And we also heard about the super grids. So we probably, all of you know, you are aware about the one sun, one world, one grid phenomena. So it may look distant, but actually a lot of such interconnections across the countries are already happening. So the picture on the right is actually showing all the interconnections which are in place or are in plan in the Middle East region. And if we connect, let's say, India to that region, so we have a grid and we can make use of all the solar, hours which are available while our peak load is happening in the evening. So all that renewable exchange will start happening. So to summarize, the key elements in this change are the communications. So from unconnected to connected elements, resources, the controls from inflexible to flexible operations, the coordination from local impacts to wide area impacts due to these elements, and services, so blurring the boundaries between the transmission and distribution and interfacing them for the wholesale as well as the retail operation. So finally, of course, there are a lot of solutions which are available already and are getting developed as the needs are getting arised. So from both, from the consumer perspective, from the community perspective, from industrial perspective, or the large network perspective. So all kinds of controllers are available. And many of you may not know, but L&T is also now in this field, and we have a lot of such solutions. And we have a booth as well in the hall. So I invite all of you to come and have a look at those solutions. Thank you.
I absolutely love it when every speaker in a panel has delivered to their time requirement. This is just fantastic. So please join me in giving them a wonderful, wonderful round of applause. because we accomplished two things today. One is, of course, the time management side of it, which is somewhat simpler, but we had a discussion on a broad range of these topics that actually are very critical to what we are trying to do, right? As I said, we've been talking about net zero, reduced carbon footprint and all that stuff. We're talking about the enlightened customer. And today we actually started talking about how do we actually deliver to that? What systems do we need? What communications do we need? And before I go off into opening up the discussion, I wanted to close out the conversation that we had on data centers. And Ravi, I know you had something to add to it. There's a microphone right next to you. Please use that. And if you can add to your comments, I would really appreciate it.
Yeah, I think I was in California just before coming here, and the subject was actually on data centers. I had the same question when I saw the curve on residential going up. But that being aside, yes, there has been a tremendous improvement of efficiency. You are right that from a panel about 7 years ago was 30 kilowatts a panel on the data center. Today it's 15 kilowatts. So yes, we can clap ourselves, that we did well. But the panels that used to house only 50 modules is now housing 100 modules, because every data center is becoming hyperscale. Yeah. And therefore, when you look at 100,000 square feet, you look at large numbers, actually the megawatt demand is increasing, not decreasing.
Yes.
The second thing to your point is every country now wants to control where the data should reside. So it is not that you can take it to Iceland and have all these data centers sitting in Iceland. So now hotter countries are going to deal with it in a big way. So those are the two things I thought I would add, that it is a very, very challenging aspect. Thank you.
Actually, I will add a third challenge to it. One of the things we are finding out is there is a place near Washington, D.C. in the U.S. It's called Loudoun County. And for those who don't know it, its claim to fame is it's the world's largest concentration of data centers, because it's not just got the Googles, the Microsoft, the Amazons, their data centers. It also has every three-letter agency in the U.S. Department of Energy, Defense, NSA, CIA, FBI, all of their data centers is there. So one of the things that they have found out now, to your point, Ravi, that the data center load is actually growing is because they are predicting that they will build somewhere between 4 to 6 data centers per year in that location. And the local electric utility has basically said, I have no way. So the very interesting problem we are finding today is that it's no longer supply constraint, because they have the supply, it is delivery constraint. How do I get that much electricity into that location so that I can supply? So I was having a parallel conversation with my close friend who actually runs all of the data centers for Microsoft. He designs them, he runs them. He said, nowadays, we are now no longer looking at data centers as, okay, we can put it anywhere. Where can I get the power for that data center in a predictable manner, not even cost effective. They're actually not that price sensitive from a power perspective, but they want it predictable. And they're trying to figure that out first before they even decide where to locate the data centers. So kind of keeping that in mind, we are actually looking at very innovative solutions to not just use electricity, but also natural gas, so that you can actually have alternate forms of energy being delivered, at least in the near term. Anant.
Thank you, Mani. Very interesting, Ravi, you brought up the topic. A couple of things in data centers. The whole data center siting strategy, right, is fundamentally premised on leveraging and placing data centers as close to transmission access capacity, transmission access, as close to transmission access facilities as possible. The challenge they're increasingly finding is, traditionally, the major hyperscalers, forget about the co-locations and the enterprise, traditionally, except for a couple, most of the hyperscalers were pretty much connecting at medium voltage level, 69 kV and below. But in an interesting twist, practically now, even co-location data centers are now looking at either 115 kV, 230 kV or above. Now, that's going to impact us in a couple of ways, and I think Mani alluded to that in our energy transition course. The whole transmission planning is going to have to dramatically change and alter. In fact, working with one of the major utilities in our west region of United States, which is actually, they were commenting their number one interconnection requirement, two interconnection requirements, no longer industrial customers and commercial customers. The two major interconnection requirements are data centers and IPPs for generation, renewables, right? So what it does is, to your point, as you mentioned earlier, that generation variability and the load variability, right? That is one aspect. The second aspect is, you talked about data centers. From a planning perspective, their overall load is increasing. They're looking at it in 3 steps, right? The first step is, does the existing facility where they have, does it allow for hosting more data, basically, more hardware? If it doesn't, does another existing facility in the same data center area, can that house more buildings? And the third step finally is, do we need to build a new data center complex in and of itself? What they're increasingly finding is the third option is where they're going, and that's not going to be sustainable in the long run from a transmission perspective, I think.
I'm going to change the dialogue a little bit, and this is a question more for Luciano and Mr. Amitabh. Let me phrase a slightly different question if I can. Both of you talked about flexible DERs, right? Both of you had a little bit of a discussion on flexible DERs. I would love to get your thoughts on, today's dispatch mechanism, the way we look at it, right? I have a 4-word mantra for all of that stuff, which is model, forecast, dispatch, settle. When you have third-party DERs, which you do a lot nowadays, is model, forecast, dispatch, and settle, right? So keeping that in mind, when you are heading into a mechanism where you've got renewable resources that are not, you're almost going from a known quantity to a statistical quantity, how do you see that movement happening? You first, and then after that you, and then anybody else in the panel can join as well.
I mean, you mentioned forecasting. Forecast is important. If you have a wrong forecasting of your load, you don't plan your grid refurbishment right. So, and data center can really suck a lot of energy, not only for data, but for cooling, for anything they need. They need a high quality power. They need a usually DC link in order not to have a fluctuation with the voltage or noise, whatever. So it's a special case that you need to be planned in advance. When you have a new line, sometimes you need 7 years because you need to plan in advance, you need a right away, whatever. In this case, it can be much faster. Nevertheless, you have to forecast which are the need from the customer, how you can provide this energy locally or from elsewhere. So I think every problem needs to be solved by a very concrete, detailed analysis, and then the settle is the last part, when you just provide the energy. Of course, the urban city have space is very limited, so a new line is difficult to pass through. We have also this possibility of having hybrid DC-AC line that could help. And you generate DC, you also transmit DC in some case. So we are studying that. And as I said, I mean, planning and forecasting goes end to end. Thank you.
Thank you. Amitabh.
Yeah, no, I agree with what you said. And only yesterday I was having discussions with some of the renewable developers. And the challenge they face is, I mean, the accuracy of forecasting.
Yes.
And then if they have, let us say, one resource, then maybe it's easier. But they have, let's say, solar and wind, and they are committed to provide some firm power. So dispatching both of them simultaneously to have firm power and round-the-clock power. So that is a big challenge. And there are, of course, solutions available for each independently, but managing both of them together and then dispatching while keeping the commitment. So that's the real area, I mean, where people are looking for solutions. And yeah, so that's the challenge as of now.
Anybody else in the panel would like to join in?
Yeah, very quickly. About 12 years ago when we began this, and you were a part of that as well, 100 megawatts of wind was 7 megawatts to the system operator. It was as pitiful as that. Right? And then with algorithms and other things, we brought it up to about 22, 24%. We have not made any dramatical increases. Why? Because sometimes the wind and the solar is what I call concatenated risk. A cloud cover comes and then it just goes in a particular way, as opposed to what I call a distributed probability or a random probability. So this issue of what's called a capped risk because of other environmental constraints is a big issue that we are not wanting to talk about. We are always talking about some probabilistic approach.
Yeah.
And the second aspect is the entire thing on DERMS and DER is about going from a deterministic world to a probabilistic world. And as long as a human being doesn't want to be adaptable, you are not going to get what you want to, because in the past it was a deterministic world with all coal and oil. So that needs to actually be talked about. In IRENA, we are beginning to talk about that now. But in other institutions, in fact, very rarely do we talk about it. So those are the two things.
Anything to add?
Maybe just to add another dimension when we look at our net zero objectives and where focus is placed. What we see is that there's a big focus on the grid edge solutions. We need more EVs, we need distributed PV. There's a big focus on renewables, there's a huge focus on hydrogen going forward. And the one thing that does not get focus is grids, is power systems. You do not see ministers making huge statements about the importance of grids. You do not see them excited about investments in grids. You do not see enough money flowing to training and capacity building and building the skills of the future for grids. You do not see programs creating sufficient incentives for the investments in grids that are needed. And I think that's a balance that needs to be shifted going forward, because if we don't focus on grids, all the other things, we will not be able to extract maximum value out of them.
Absolutely. I'm going to give Mr. Mukesh an opportunity, and then Ravi, I'll come back to you.
Yeah, definitely forecasting is becoming more and more important aspect both for generation and distribution. Earlier times we had only the demand forecasting, because actually there was no need of generation forecasting, as almost all the power plants were either available or not available in terms of their output, apart from having that coal shortage scenario or something like that. So as a distribution utility, we were used to forecast for demand only.
Yes.
Now the problem is that we have to also forecast about the generation from where we are getting the renewable power. If I have tie-up from the southern region of Tamil Nadu, maybe from Gujarat, then to Rajasthan, Maharashtra, then I have to keep a system where it can track the weather and other parameters in these states also. And apart from all, there is always a mandate from the system operator that they should schedule their output energy, the generation. But still, at my end, it is also essential for me to have how much energy I am going to get from the Gujarat plant or Tamil Nadu plant or something like that. So that is the additional feature in the forecasting which has been added in my portfolio. Absolutely. Apart from that, as the internal generation is also increasing, then my demand is actually the net of actual demand and internal generation. So again, this comes into the picture, how much I will be generating tomorrow. Absolutely. Through these distributed resources. So more and more complexities are becoming the part of this my demand forecasting exercise. So whatever system I built over the years through the support of my technical partners is now no more throwing me good results just because of this kind of uncertainties. So having demand forecast alone is not going to work for me.
Not enough at all. Absolutely. Ravi, if you can hold up for a minute, I wanted to see if the audience had any questions also, because I may ask you to kind of get one of the closing comments. Yes, sir. Can somebody get a mic to him, please?
Thank you. Question for Vida. You briefly touched upon digital twin and the importance of grid in the overall scheme of things. I'm aware of a conversation I had with a company called Arup for UK National Grid, and they are trying to build a digital twin at a national grid scale. So what's the feasibility of that, and do you think something materializing in India similar to what is being tried out in UK? Thank you.
Does anybody want to pick it up? There's a microphone right there.
Thank you. That's a very good question. The technology is there. It's a big undertaking to even make it at a local level. Or part of a system is already a bit undertaking. The data is there, the technologies are there. It's about getting the consortium together to be able to do that. It's about bringing the expertise that you need, and digital twins are only as good as the data and the people using them. So they're a fantastic tool, they're great opportunities, the functionalities are evolving at a hugely rapid pace. It's a great frontier to explore, but it really does need the skills with the people inputting the data and utilizing the insights, so it needs to go hand in hand, but an exciting area, definitely.
Anybody else would like to respond to that?
I can take a try.
Go for it.
Yeah, see, at the asset level, digital twins work very well. I mean, we have done that for the last 6-7 years. When you take it at a community level, you take it at a substation level, or even a larger area level, the data requirements actually become tremendous. Let me give you an example. When we put our smart grid together 15 years ago, our total amount of transaction for the utility was more than all the credit cards and the debit cards of all of Canada put together. So all of a sudden our MDMR became big Taj Mahals, right, literally. And so the question was, we were asked in the utility, oh, just cull it all, don't keep all your data forever, and who's going to keep what. But you will know, if the consumer wants it for historical and for probabilistic analysis and for AI, that data has got to be kept by somebody else. So the question was, who would pay for it? So that is number one. Number two, on the probability, increasing probability to 80-90% of DER, the amount of data you will have to pump in to be able to manage that is 7 times, I'm not kidding, the amount of data you got today. So 20%, 25% is easy. Try to take it to 80-85%, as many organizations would like you to take it. It is not very, very simple. And so you have to also factor in all these communications and data that has got to go in before you can say, I can make a very intellectual decision on a true diversified portfolio of assets.
Thank you. One last question. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for the excellent panel. My name is Alvaro. I'm working on DPB and digitalization. I wanted to ask a question to Mr. Mukesh, please, and also to the other panel members on forecasting of DPB, more in particular. What works? What doesn't work? What are your key lessons learned? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So I mentioned that we started this exercise of using system tools in demand forecasting in 2007-8, and we tried different solutions to test for this thing, and through our domain expertise and the system intelligence and other factors, we were able to achieve around 2 to 2.5% of error on day-ahead basis, barring some few days where uncertain weather was there. But again, from the last couple of years, as the generation side or the resource side is becoming more and more variable and uncertain, then probably this is not sufficient task to forecast the demand only. You have to simultaneously, because ultimately you have to assess the gap. The purpose of demand forecasting is what is the actual gap between the supply and the demand. That's why you can adjust through the available markets or different resources, and you can optimize your scheduling procedure to optimize the overall power purchase cost. That's the only objective of demand forecasting, nothing else. So as the generation is becoming more and more variable, your gap analysis is also uncertain in terms of, even if you are within the 2% error of demand forecasting. So that's the challenge we are facing from the last couple of years as the more and more renewable is entering into our power portfolio. The second aspect, as I mentioned, that in yesteryears, we were forecasting the demand. It was more or less a kind of pure demand. But now it is net of demand because of internal generation. So again, we have to shift our focus to the local distributed the solar generation and other things. Now tomorrow, I'm sure that another factor of this demand response, energy storage devices and other things will also come into picture. So basically, the system is going to be very, very complex, and demand forecasting alone may not work for most of the utilities in coming times.
Actually, something that I can add to that is once we are actually implementing it at one major utility in the US, and really we are now creating a new term called DER and end-use forecasting. Because in places where there is a residence that they have a certain level of consumption and a certain level of production, you need to know both the consumption pattern and the production pattern, because just focusing on the net is inadequate, because the net depends a lot more on the consumer's personal desires, because they may decide that I have a storage in my garage and I'm going to use that excess solar to store, or take that excess solar, send it back into the grid. So we are actually now separating the two, because demand or consumption is actually a little more easier, whereas production, depending upon the thousands of locations where you could have variable energy resources, is actually quite complex. Because I need to know, if I have Anant who's got a solar farm, I need to know if there is a puffy cloud on top of his house or on top of his solar farm, at which point in time his solar farm is going to go from 100% production down to 10. I need to know that, because as you go into slightly bigger farms, it's going to have a direct impact on my dispatch equation, right? And one of the things I find fascinating is that as you go into probabilistic model, at the end game, in real time, I still have to balance supply and load. That doesn't go away. There is nothing probabilistic about that. That is very deterministic. So we need to figure out how to take this probabilistic equation and move it to a deterministic equation, because at the end game, my frequency has to be 50 or 60. That's not negotiable. Your regulator is not going to negotiate that, and you screw up on that, you'll get some massive fines. We are very close to closing our time. Ravi, I wanted to give you that opportunity to close down your thought process on, I think it was, you had some extra things to contribute, please.
Yeah, I think it's a great discussion, and I think we touched about the full 360, thanks to some of us who have been involved in this for the last 15 years. But let me tell you one thing. I had the job of writing letters to the minister by my president, where you have to take a technical issue to tell him no, but how do you convert it into policy for somebody who doesn't understand? And I would always say, the laws of how electricity flows is not determined by what a policy says. It's by the laws of electromagnetics and physics. And so to the extent that the policy matches this, the electron will flow properly. Otherwise, you're not going to get it. The second aspect is the word energy is very deceiving, because energy is scalar. For those of you who are in the power systems, vector 1 plus 1 is not 2. It can be 1.44, it can be 1.7, it could be 1. And we in the real power system world are having that issue to deal with when we talk of VAR support, we talk of power system quality, etc. So in the energy business, 1 plus 1 is 2. And so it becomes an easier way of doing your calculations. So that is something I wanted to just talk about.
With that, I would like to close this session down. I want to thank India Smart Grid Forum for allowing us this opportunity to run this session. I would like to thank my esteemed panelists. Please give them a thunderous round of applause. I truly appreciate what they have brought, just because there's so much expertise. And I'm sure many of you wanted to have a lot more questions. Please seek us out on the corridors or in other places, and most of you know where to find most of us. Thank you so much again. We truly appreciate your time.
So thank you so much, Dr. Vadari, for excellently moderating this panel. I would now request you to please felicitate our distinguished panelists today with a small memento of thank you. To Ms. Vida, thank you so much for joining us.